I am a poet, here is a poem. As oceans rise, so ancestors beneath. It is safe, shimmering satin slip, tremorous earthquake, rumbling with grief electromagnetic, beckoning the Saturnine sea, salt, plastic, and calcium, unbounded, at once sanguine among its descendants, from steel and soil, saccharine moon mirror rising through warped atmospheric pressure, to breathe underwater. Last year, I wrote Fits, a biomythography. It's composed of photos, poems, and video works, beholden to ancestral ecologies, queer intimacies, and interdisciplinary madness. Fits is a capsule of becoming, other with the Great Plains, traversing precarious grain silos, hydroelectric dams, and desertified prairie. I archive the sites, seeds, and synchronicities of injury, ritual, and transformation that compose the gradual processes of growing a garden ripe and rendered for emancipation. That is to say, everything that I write is in some way about home, land, and exile. My mother is a white Southerner. My father is a Nigerian Southerner. I both exile and am exiled. I come from a place where BP sets the water on fire with oil, and I'm about to share with you a little bit more about these lands. I'm not sure if all of you are from around here. Call me Ray. I am a teacher. Today I'm reading 2 essays because to be a Black femme is to be vulnerable, and I'd like to share with you just what I'm thinking. I'm Gen Z. I grew up on the internet and in rural southern Kansas. My deepest relationships are with land and machines. Necropolitical compost right. I wrote this in January after a woman and her dog died from cold 3 blocks away from me at a pond. Necropolitics is a philosophical theory that explores the relationship between sovereignty and power over life and death. All right. After 16 years destabilizing the governance of Capricorn, Pluto, contestable planet of destruction, enters the threshold of Aquarius. The gospel is revived in AI war machines, martyrs live broadcast destruction, predictive surveillance incarcerates, incinerates. No sanctity, the Keystone Pipeline spills nearly 600,000 gallons of oil in my backyard, that is 3 counties over. Fertilizer nitrogen and Israeli phosphorus from ICL performance products saturate the Kaw River. Slow violence, the coal plant down the street commingles with interstate exhaust, noxious air. Impending failure, the infrastructure vulnerable to obliterative magnetic metric pulse. I just read Glitch Feminism by Legacy Russell, and I'm reading The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, would recommend. I am thinking about how identity-based individuation, particularly of and in the West, is contingent upon minor minors of the global majority. Think the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm wondering, how do we begin thinking of technology as a sacred plane? That is hardware composed of living, sentient, and non-sentient materials, mineral skeletons, extracted by and at the cost of human and non-human, human and animals, paired with software, an extension, echo extraction of biometric data and connectivity desires, the invisible matter, if you're thinking about physics, the unknowable in the age of information. This is beyond industry, industrialization. This is the ether net, the Orisha conceived by water and oil, the Andromedonian pull of decay. Extinction and evolution are inevitable, kinds of eternities, but what of this death in the meantime, across generations and millennia? I hold death in my pouch. I cannot die. Fela Kuti. Oversimply, if Adam and Eve eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is Foucault's biopolitics, then Cain, the agriculturalist, killing Abel, the shepherd, is Mbembe's necropolitics. That is, the apple imbues in the consumer the power to determine who gets to live, who dies, and the extent to and conditions under which one lives or dies. The agriculturalist takes this apple and cultivates homogeneous fields of life to sustain a type of life that concurrently kills other lives, is dependent on the dying of other lives. Necropolitical violence to death is coercive and ubiquitous, material, psychic, and social, is erasure, eradication, abandonment, betrayal, is extraction, hoarding, disposability, disabling, is climate catastrophe, reproductive terror, fascist nationalism, poverty, and perpetual conflict. War is our most beloved ritual. Hatred, both an inheritance and an addiction. Death for profit is the currency of industrial modernity. We watch lynchings and genocides on our cell phones. We play first-person shooter games and launch drones with wireless controllers. On TikTok, it's relevant, unalive is the censor term or euphemism for death. We can't say the word death, kill, was killed, committed suicide, died. Capitalism affords us 1 week to no bereavement depending on the biological degree of proximity. Proximity demands, or productivity demands we get over it. Arms and funeral industries alienate us from collective and cultural rites of death. How do we begin to face great grief of perpetual death and dying, of denial, destruction, and decay? I think the more intentionally we bear witness to the psychic and emotional mattering of the terror and trauma we endure and perpetuate, the more we recognize the global interconnectedness of our struggle for liberation, the slower we'll have to go. Slow like rot, like tension seeping and stinking, slow like weeping and solutionless, slow like refusal, like unable, unwilling to work, slow like deep sleep, deep trust, like the walk of trees. Thank you, Toni Morrison's grandmother. Slow like care and craft, like knowing that our living need not rely on the death of others, need not rely on the sweatshops of fast fashion, the monocrops of agriculture, the prisons of legislation. When we employ a project of living that takes death and dying seriously, that demands sovereignty in the process and posthumously, we slow, thus slowing the consumptive wounding of necropolitical violence eventually to a halt. When I am 16, Black Mirror, Netflix, releases San Junipero, a lesbian story of queer futurity that shows the freedoms in choosing your dying and complicates the duality of life and death in a physical body versus beyond the body. They have the option to upload their consciousness to a simulated reality. I don't think that uploading our consciousness to a simulated reality is sustainable, materially or psychically, but the narrative conclusion is that bones will always be returned to the land and spirit will always be returned to the ether. As often, I return to Igbo Landing, 1803, walking into the water of Dunbar Creek, mass suicide instead of enslavement. They sung, "The water spirit brought us, the water spirit will take us home." As I lie in my January rot, my muscles twitch and ache, dry from cold, tense with anger, I realize I must recollect the courage to take up the case of my body, to claim opacity, to not show up slowly, to vibrate my vagal nerve with loud singing and piano playing, to dance my organs and stretch my fascia. As contentious, coerced, and precarious as this body is, I am still sanctuary to spirit. There is still something potent and feeling within. I want us to die with autonomy, dignity, and integrity. I want us to die with faith in love. The second essay is Agricultural Poetics 2. in the belly. Lunar New Year is here right now, tomorrow, and last week was Imbolc, Candlemas, Groundhog Day, the turning of spring. This is the second agricultural poetics essay I've published. The first was in 2022. This covers new things. Imbolc is the bowl between the crests of winter, solstice, and spring equinox. St. Bridget pulls reeds from the softening soil to weave a cross. The badger, the groundhog, the prairie dog emerge from underground, prophetic. The genus Homo evolved out of Africa about 2.5 million years ago. Thenceforth, at least a dozen different human species emerged. Homo sapiens, us, appeared about 200,000 years ago and became the last remaining human species about 10,000 years ago. The agricultural revolution began about 12,000 years ago and ushered in the Anthropocene, that is, the sixth extinction, accelerated lately by colonial globalization about 500 years ago and the Industrial Revolution about 200 years ago. Agriculture initiates the Anthropocene because it requires habitat destruction and eradication of biodiversity, deforestation, animal displacement, and monocropping. About 100 years ago, the Dust Bowl swirled around drought. Some areas of the Midwest lost up to 75% of the topsoil to twisters. People died from dust pneumonia. In 2020, researchers found that 90% of the globe's topsoil is thinning. 16% of the soil has a lifespan of less than a century. For the last 25 years, half of the Midwest, over half, has experienced a drought. If practiced, regenerative indigenous land practices, no-till, plant rematriation, land resting, rotting, could prevent another Dust Bowl, could revive biospheres, could help us re-inhabit what lies beneath destruction. From Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, 90% of the calories that feed humanity come from a handful of plants that our ancestors domesticated between 9,500 and 3,500 BC. Wheat, rice, corn, potatoes, millet, and barley. A plantation is an area of land cultivated for cash crops. A cash crop is an agricultural product grown for profit instead of for consumption or use by the people who grew it. Product may be contrasted with yield in the context of subsistence crops, grown for consumption and use by the people who cultivated the land, like my father used to. In the antebellum South, cotton, grain, tobacco, sugarcane, and rice were the big five cash crops. A plantation economy is based on mass agricultural production. Mass agricultural production requires laborers or slaves. Converting production to profit requires extraction of soil and labor, and export, requiring trade agreements between nation states and fossil fuels for transportation. For the last 6 months, I have been the final set of human hands in the assembly line of mass agricultural production. I unbox produce, merchandise the product, aestheticize abundance. The produce department donates expired or nearly expired food to the food bank. We compost moldy, rotten, or destroyed food into feed for local animals. Employees can consume none of this food, but get a discount at the company store. Here in the northern plains, our big five cash crops are corn, soy, wheat, sorghum, and cattle, including dairy. A third of corn is used to feed the cattle, another third is used as a fuel additive, and the rest goes into processed foods like chips, beer, and syrup. Soybeans and sorghum have similar stories. The cattle that these crops feed compact the soil, displace bison, and emit methane. Wheat is nutrient-rich and covers more earth than any other crop, but wheat is increasingly connected to chronic inflammation. In the US, 2012, about a decade ago, gluten-related disorders from celiac disease, which is an autoimmune disease, to non-celiac gluten sensitivity, often comorbid with IBS, affect over 10% of the population. Dr. Rupa Maria, co-author of Inflamed Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Justice, says, trauma is really registered and held in the body and manifested through chronic inflammatory states. Social and environmental factors are more predictive of the onset of inflammatory diseases like cardiovascular disease or diabetes or cancer than even genetic factors. The conditions under and singularity with which wheat is cultivated and consumed could be called a perpetual trauma, the loss of land and habitats and gut microbiomes. With exceptions and nuance, USDA organic produce is grown in soil that has no synthetic fertilizers, NPK+, sewage sludge, or pesticides applied for 3 years prior to harvest. Plant irradiation and genetic engineering are also not allowed. Plants get their nutrients from the soil, the produce symbiotic, same as soil. Following this, inorganic food is necessarily or presumably a kind of synthetic. Synthetic agriculture like DDT, an insecticide and carcinogenic, thank you Rachel Carson. Agent Orange, dioxin, a herbicide and carcinogenic that the US sprayed over 20 million gallons over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia between 1961 and 1971. ICL Group manufactures specialty chemicals like white phosphorus for farm fertilizer and Israel's bombs. An AP News headline, prisoners in the US are part of a hidden workforce linked to hundreds of popular food brands. I really encourage everyone to look into Angola and Louisiana in general right now. Children, immigrants, and prisoners labor in the field crops and factories. They are the hands mixing and spraying, harvesting from and processing in the sludge, the radiation, the pesticides. They are the hands packing and unpacking containers, fueling trucks, preparing product. Economically, people like me, generally can't afford organics. We are coerced instead into physically and psychically unsafe labor conditions to make rent and pay taxes that go to war. But what does it mean to be able to afford something? How do we afford the cost of spirit? The exploited land, the slave labor, the factory-farmed animals, the chemical food. Organics, plant-based, gluten-free, takeaway, homegrown, home-cooked, culture-based food are privileges, and the point is that they should not be. Our bodies, spirits, and futures cannot afford anything other than these privileges. Our unique cultures, our organs, the land cannot survive without freed food, free food, freed food. Audre Lorde, our children cannot dream unless they live. They cannot live unless they are nourished. And who else will feed them the real food without which their dreams will be no different than ours? 70% of the martyrs in Palestine are women and children. Israel has forced starvation diets intermittently for over a decade. The Israeli defense minister calls Palestinian animals. Thus, humanitarian aid is not allowed into the occupied territory. Thus, North Gazans are forced to use animal feed to make bread. Israel destroys ancient olive trees. It outlaws foraging for zatar, wild thyme, and achub, wild thistle in Palestine, then turns around and cultivates them on 2 plantations associated with a neighboring kibbutz to sell the wild plants back to Palestinians. Agriculture is the inception of our present and the crux of our future. Food sovereignty is at the core of our collective liberation. Returning to the land, returning land, remaining inland in the heartland is potent, devastating, and transformative. In the same cadence as Combahee River, we will not be free until the land is free, until the people, plants, and animals of the land are free. Imbolc means in the belly. The imperial core is the belly of the beast, a society of gross abundance and distributive disparities. Internally, we must liberate our bellies from the beast, from fast food and fat phobia, factory farms, and forced labor. Susan Raffo says, the innermost golden fat layer keeps us warm and padded, keeps stores of energy, and connects our outside listening skin to our inside body. Fat is also protection. What does it say about a people who turn this gold fluid, this sweet insulation, into something to be eradicated, a sign of shame? Now is the time to open the cookbook, to knead bread, to feed your neighbor, to start compost piles, encrypted networks, phone trees, to dance outside with spice shakers filled with native seeds, to seek the dream, the struggle, the shadow. Destruction and devastation will continue until we halt. In the meantime, we emerge from the cold dumps of winter into the conscious warmth of spring. The powers that be might kill 1, 2, or 3 roses, but they will never be able to stop the spring from coming. Thank you.